Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris here with John Stonestreet and Maria Baer. We're talking this week about 2021, what we can look forward to, what we need to think about as Christians as we consider the coming year. You can find links to the stories that we're going to talk about today by visiting breakpoint.org, where you'll also find commentaries and resources every day to help you think and live like a Christian in today's culture. Well, guys, last week we looked back on the stories of 2020 and the biggest themes of 2020 that sort of emerged, and we hit everything from celebrity pastors to the loss of social trust to what the rationale behind declaring certain businesses and jobs and churches non-essential in the midst of the COVID-19 lockdowns was. And I think some excellent themes emerged from there that we're going to be able to pick up on today's program as we discuss the important ideas that are going to influence how we live and think in 2021.
And before we do that, I mean, this is kind of part two for us, and Maria was with us last week, but I kind of feel like our audience, I mean, she sat in for you, I guess a couple months ago. Maria, is that when you sat in the last time?
Last month?
Last month?
Like,
I know
yeah,
it seems like forever ago, but it was 2020, so no one knows what time it is or what day it is. But, Maria's just kind of part of the team now at the Colson Center. She's been working with our editorial staff, writing commentaries, helping me specifically on Breakpoint commentaries. You've seen her byline if you get our Breakpoint emails. But we just kind of went along as if it were business as usual last week. And I'm wondering if maybe some of our listeners are like, who's that girl? You know, you guys have been so chauvinistic, male-centric for so long. Suddenly, just throw in a girl, not even mention it. So,
no, that's what they always tell you. Pretend like you're supposed to be in the room. I've just been here this whole time. You just didn't notice.
Well, that's actually good advice. Actually, my college basketball coach said, if you ever dunk it, which, by the way, he wasn't talking to me because I'm too short, but he said, if you ever dunk it, don't like jump down and flex. Just act like you do that all the time, which is really good advice. So, Maria, you followed that advice, which is good. But, Maria, it's great to have you as part of the Colson Center team, as one of our writers and researchers and everything that you do for us. And it's good to have you here on Breakpoint this week again.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you guys.
So what's 2020? What's going to happen in 2021? That's a prediction time. What could go wrong? I mean, 2020 was so easy to predict. I mean, think about before we go there. A year ago, right? If we were doing this show a year ago, I mean, can you imagine going, hey, here's what's about to happen in 2020? I mean, no one would have been. It's got to be at least a little humbling for all of us as we're trying
tremendously
to think
humbling. What's coming this year? I mean, if we had done this kind of show last year, and let's be honest, a global pandemic doesn't hit every single year. 2020 was sort of an exceptional year, but if we had recorded this kind of show back then, it would be one of the single most irrelevant pieces of media ever to emerge from the Colson Center by like February. We're not even talking by the end of the year. We're talking by like February here. And that reminds me of a thought I had before we got on to record this here, was that last week, I think it was, John, I made the remark that, or maybe the week before, I made the remark that we all expect 2021 subconsciously in some way to change something, right? The calendar is going to change, and we got a new year ahead of us, and we can just start fresh, and everything's going to be reset. And I don't think everything's going to be reset, but the more I thought about what I said there, the more I realized that, hey, I'm kind of stepping on a divine theme or a divine promise there that I shouldn't be trampling down. Because the Bible says that God's mercies are new every morning, and that He gives us these cycles by which we can take advantage of His renewed mercies, where we fall asleep every night, and we wake up in the morning, and we realize no matter what we did yesterday, we can start fresh in God's eyes. We can move forward from there. I think the same kind of thing applies to the week and the month, and ultimately to the year, where we have this turning of the seasons and this cycle that we all recognize as giving us a fresh start. And it's why people come into years with New Year's resolutions saying, I'm going to be a better person. I'm going to do something different this year. I'm not going to make this mistake I made last year. So there is meaning here that I wasn't really cognizant of. So I want to take that back, because we can, in a sense.
When did you become an optimist? Like what happened here? What happened?
I'm a post-millennialist, John. I've been optimistic for several years.
An ultimate optimist. Yeah,
I'm a post-millennial.
Yeah, it's true in the divine economy. but the things that we saw that we talked about last week,
Yeah.
people, if they missed it, these things aren't going away either.
Right.
One of the last commentaries of the year had to do with reconciling across broken lines. I mean, you think about the awkward Thanksgivings and the awkward Christmases, and that was just on Zoom, not to mention the ones that actually happened in person. The family breakdown and over issues, as I said in the commentary, that mattered. It's not like, there's two ways of looking at this. Some of them were actual, right and wrong, very clear. And within the Christian circle in particular, there's a whole lot of people that left churches in 2020. And because they were mad. There's a whole lot of people that decided, I'm not going to talk to that family member anymore because they were mad. There's a whole lot of people that said, that person who I worked with on a number of causes, I'm dealing with this right now, with other Christian ministry leaders, and there are some that have been written off completely, maybe rightly so, maybe not. And at the same time, it's like, well, how we can't go back. Now we have to go forward, and these things really aren't going anywhere. I don't want to steal all the thunder of that beautiful passage that you just quoted, but 2021, there's going to have to be, I think Jesus once said, before you offer your prayer, go and be reconciled to your brother. It was funny, as soon as we quoted that too in Breakpoint, everyone was like, well, I don't want to. We got a lot of people that commented that, said, no, I'm not going to do it, don't want to. And you go, okay, that's fair enough. I don't know that I want to either. Jesus didn't say, if you feel like it, go and reconcile. He said, go and reconcile. I think that's going to be one of the big storylines of 2021. How are we going to move together? How are we going to move forward together as families and as churches?
Well, and what Jesus says right after that is he's basically saying, do it now because you're going to have to do it. You're going to be held to account either by a judge who will make you do it, or you could go do it yourself. And I don't know what that looks like in each person's relationship and how God is going to bring about justice and that sort of thing. But I'm not in charge of that, thankfully. But I think that's kind of what he was getting at when he's asking us to do that hard work. I almost think he's saying it's going to be harder if you wait. It's going to be harder for you and for them. So just do it now. You don't. And that when he says that, it's not long either after or before. I think he says that right before he teaches them how to pray. And one of the central themes of the Lord's Prayer is saying, give me today what I need today. And I think that's, part of his same sermon for a reason, because he wants us to be present like he is present. And the present is today. So do what you can today to be reconciled and to live like you think he would have you live.
Which is sort of the permanence about what we're doing here, right? It's even if we were to make predictions about 2021 that turned out to be wildly inaccurate because something else came on and stole the stage for 12 months, it would still be true that we have to be a certain kind of person in order to get along with our neighbor, in order to love them, in order to obey God, and in order to live out a Christian worldview in all of life. No matter what comes down the pike, that's still going to be true. And the way you, Maria, the way you just alluded to that, and John, to that sort of hyperpolarization and the resulting resentment that festers between people based on the disagreements of 2020, I think it leads us into one of the key themes that we've talked about discussing here in 2021, and that is the de-escalation of some of these conflicts, especially on an interpersonal level. Not everything is the end of the world. Not everything can be treated as Armageddon. You have to pick your battles. And if everything is treated, especially everything politically, as if it is the end of America, the end of the world, the end of our freedom, and the hill on which we all must die, then this spiral continues. We keep getting more and more impassioned and more at each other's throats, and peace will become impossible. So how about it? What are the issues that we can sort of de-escalate on? How can we stop making everything Armageddon?
I think that one of the answers to that question is it has far less to do with whatever issues that we're going to face in 2021. One of the last trips I did before the lockdown, which seems like forever ago, was with my daughters, and we went through Florida. And it was we ended up speaking to groups of grandparents, and there was a group that was setting this up because of the book A Practical Guide to Culture, and it was, even back then, grandparents were telling us that they were having a really hard time communicating across the lines of technology and across the new sexual orthodoxy and about politics with their grandkids. And so one of the illustrations that I used is I asked who the oldest person in the room was, which is always a loaded question. But when you're talking to a group of essentially in a senior citizens place, there's a guy there who was 96 years old, and he stood up. And this guy had been a veteran and just a remarkable guy, And I said, what was your mom and dad's name? And I said, imagine that if your dad, back in, I forget what year he was born. I just added 10 years to it. So let's say in 1910, his dad said, all right, son, sat him down and goes, here's all the things you need to know about for your life. And here are all the moral decisions you're going to be faced with. And here's what you should do in each and every one. It would be a ridiculous conversation, right? Because there's no way that his dad could have known about World War II and the Nazis and, the Holocaust and, the Depression and what do you call it? The Great New Deal and, the
Mariah Carey's Christmas album.
And Mariah, yeah, that's right. I was getting to Nick Jonas, but no, there's no way, or Harry Styles actually, but no one would know, right? There's no way you could prepare somebody for that. So what does the Scripture give us instead? The Scripture doesn't give us every moral dilemma with every moral answer in a very black and white, measured, mechanical sort of way. The Bible is far more convinced in the sort of people we become. This is one of the reasons I love Proverbs, because as I've said before, wisdom literature in Eastern religions is so often this esoteric nonsense that you can't even make any sense of, right? It's like, I don't know. It's like the guru up on the mountain with the long beard. The Proverbs in the Bible is just like, don't do stupid things. Don't hang out with foolish people. Don't speak loudly early in the morning. You're like, that's brilliant. In other words, it's just kind of like right down at you. Be the sort of person who makes good decisions. And, we've talked so much even within our own team over the year, and I'll open the curtain here and let our listeners just hear one of the things that we've talked about, which is the importance right now of this whole, Vince Lombardi said before one of his preseason practices with his team, who had almost won the Super Bowl the year before, he started by holding up a football saying, gentlemen, this is a football. And
I've never heard this story before.
You never heard, you guys are tired of hearing it, but our listeners may not have. But the point is that we've got to go back to the beginning. And there's so many of the Proverbs, for example, that are they sound just outright revolutionary. They sound like brilliant concepts that no one had ever thought of. Like, here's one: a soft answer turns away wrath. What if we actually lived that? Like, what if that stuff was actually how we approached the issues of division? What difference would that make? So I think looking at 2021, that's the real conversation we need to have. The stories, and I think we should get to them. What can we expect politically? What can we expect internationally? I think the persecuted church, we've talked about that. We need to talk about that more. It's not getting better in Nigeria right now unless the U.S. does something. We need to talk about how we can decide what refugees can come in. But I think first and foremost, we got to go back to what the football is. We got to go back to what does it mean to be the sort of people that we need to be, so that if next year we're here and we're like, who could have imagined 2021? We can be the right sort of people, even if the headlines shock us one after another like they did last year.
We're going to talk about some of those stories in our next segment. Stay with us. We'll be right back. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of 2021, what we're anticipating here in the coming year from a Christian worldview perspective. John, you sent around a list of suggestions before we started recording here of themes we should think about and contemplate as we enter the new year, and they're tied very much to stories that we expect to be ongoing as we step into 2021. So walk us through a couple of those, and the ones that are really on your heart and mind right now, and the ones that you expect to be writing breakpoints about very shortly.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Yogi Berra said predictions are really dangerous, especially predictions about the future. Or was that Mark Twain or somebody? But anyway, they are. But look, it's like what we had talked about last week. There were these pre-existing conditions, and the pressure, the social pressure, the political pressure, the physical health pressure, the economic pressure, just revealed all of those things. I think we're going to have to figure out again what it's like. Many Christians figure out what it's like to be in a place where there's real potential for penalties for faith, right? I mean, if we remember the last term of the Obama administration, there was very much pressure on religious liberty. There was very much an advancement of issues around the LGBTQ cause. And there was a level of pressure relief that came through the form of executive orders, and these executive orders are just going to be reversed under the next administration, which is why who's in the White House doesn't ultimately solve the problems, but it is going to matter.
Live by the pen, die by the pen.
Yeah, and that's very much going to be an issue domestically. But again, I'm not even sure we can get there from here until there's some level of reconciliation and some level of confession and repentance because of how the end of last year was handled by so many of us. And I put myself into that category. It was easy to get lost. I mean, it was so easy to get lost in the middle of as the temperature was jacked so high, to not know what to say, when to say it, who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. And, it became really confusing. I also think too, the story where there were so many domestic stories that were front and center on our minds, that even though we talked about it, it didn't get maybe the attention that was due. 2020 was a dreadful year for the persecution of religious minorities. It was an awful year in Nigeria for our brothers and sisters. Our friends at ICON, the International Conference on Nigeria, go to their website. We'll link to this at Breakpoint, but they have a calendar where day by day, they track the number of Christians that were killed, that were arrested, that were beaten, or that were raped or somehow mistreated. And it is, when you realize, oh, that was just Thursday, and then there was another group Wednesday and Tuesday and Monday, it's overwhelming. And that story did not get its due because of the chaos domestically that was happening.
Yeah, I think just in thinking about the plight of people in Nigeria, specifically Christians, but also the Muslim Uyghurs in China. I was reading a story the other day about the Rohingya Muslims, which are a minority group that has made up the largest human refugee camp in the world right now in Myanmar, or they're in Bangladesh fleeing Myanmar. And it's a terrible situation. Bangladesh doesn't know what to do with them. But they were being tortured and killed and chased out of their homes. And the last thing I read was Bangladesh was transporting them to basically an island, an uninhabited island off the coast of Bangladesh that only appeared out of the ocean like 20 years ago. And a lot of human rights groups are raising alarms about it, like this thing might not be there very long. There's flooding risk and all this stuff, but they don't know what to do with all these refugees. And meanwhile, inside this refugee camp, it was basically lawless. They don't have a system of law there. So it was just it's just a reminder that the world is on fire in a lot of places. It's easy to navel gaze when you have a pandemic and an election and it's the holidays and whatever else. And with good reason, there were a lot of really high stakes issues going on here in the US, but it's quite a luxury to be worried about something like whether we used the correct word for women or people who menstruate or whatever it is now, when other people are literally like worried about whether their kids are going to, get kidnapped the next day. And it's just a reminder to, I guess not think too much on our own troubles.
Maria, John, help me out with this, because this is the point at which, as as a Christian, as a dad, as someone who has to write and think about this stuff, I often come up against a brick wall, because I'm just like, I just wrote a paper on the efficacy of prayer. So obviously prayer is a huge part of the answer, but it feels like we talk about these international stories of religious persecution in particular, and this sense of helplessness just washes over me. This sense that, well, what can I do? How can I be used, little old me, to make some kind of difference for these people whose lives are being wrecked and destroyed by persecution? And I know that there are some pretty good answers, downstream from prayer, so to speak, where you donate to organizations that expose this kind of stuff, and we could name a bunch of those, where you petition your own government to intervene in particular ways, or to administer sanctions, or what have you. There are a bunch of these different routes, but it just feels so often like I wish that I could end their suffering right now, that I could just rescue them from that sort of thing. And it on one level, it is the reaction of a spoiled Westerner who's just like, "Oh, there should never be suffering in the world. You should never have to. You should never have to pay a price, particularly for your testimony of Christ, regardless of what the New Testament says on the matter." That's my spoiled Westerner attitude. But another part of me really, I think, legitimately wishes to see the blessings of liberty shared. We have something extremely special here in the United States, and we lose sight of that in the midst of all of our political wrangling and rancor. But religious freedom is something that the majority of the population of the world, for the majority of history, have not enjoyed. And it's a precious blessing, and a fragile one, because the default state is religious repression and violence, and we see that all around the world today. So, I mean, help me out, because that's my impasse. But I think a feeling of humble thankfulness is part of the appropriate posture of approaching this, right?
I think it is. I think that there's a huge point. This is something that you and I talked about a couple weeks ago. But the narrative right now is that anyone who tries to defend, for example, religious liberty is just trying to serve themselves. They're just trying to protect their own beliefs. The worst spin on it is that they just want to have their own special right to discriminate and be hateful and intolerant. Religious liberty has made the world a dramatically better place. Cultures that actually allow freedom of conscience, that respect the fact that people are allegiant to something beyond the government or beyond the dominant popular opinion, that actually is such a good. It creates so many other goods in a culture. It creates so many other opportunities. It creates a level of freedom. It creates a level of self-sustainment. There's so many things that flow from that. And it's almost like a culture that was built on it now wants to keep the goods but lose what it was built on. It's not unlike a culture that loves the concept of human dignity but wants to not have anything like the image of God or the idea that we were created, which you don't get human dignity if it's not given to you or given to everyone by the Creator. So
this is Os Guinness's concept of the cut flower civilization, right? We want the pretty flower, but we don't want the roots that sustained it in the first place.
No, that's exactly right. And so this is why it actually is doing something for some of our persecuted brothers and sisters around the world, to not let religious liberty be squandered here in America. It seems self-serving, and it can be self-serving if it's seen that way or if it's done that way. But it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be. It actually should be for the good of others. I do think, and I don't want to be callous at all. I mean, there's a lot of Christians that talk about persecution as if it's something good that we should pray for and that we should want. Now, I don't think that. I do think it's important for all of us to recognize that if you're a Christian living in a cultural moment and you're not being actively persecuted, you're in the minority. You're not in the norm. You're out of step with the history of the world. You're not in step. The vast majority of Christians in the history of the world have faced a level of intolerance or persecution or discrimination to some degree for what they believe. And so we are in a unique place in history, and we should be very grateful, realizing that we didn't choose to be born in this time and place. God chose for us to be born in this time and in this place. And so there's nothing there that we specifically deserve. That's what was extremely frustrating for me last year in making calls to the Trump administration to follow through with its promise to protect the Christian vulnerable populations, particularly Christian refugees. The spigot on the refugee population in America dried up, and it was against the promises of Vice President Pence and President Trump. And I got hammered. It's like, we got to take care of ourselves first. That's the exact wrong place to begin when it comes to religious liberty or when it comes to policy. It doesn't mean we're not wise. It doesn't mean we don't vet. It doesn't mean we aren't smart about it. I think a case could be made where we would prioritize Christian refugees over other religious refugees. But at the same time, this is a good for the world, and it's something that we need to preserve. Still, in light of the fact that most Christians do face that level of persecution, there is a level of the horse and his boy to this. And I'm thinking of that book in the Narnia series where Aslan's, walking up the mountain. Shasta is walking up the mountain and sees himself walking beside Aslan. It's the first time that he's met Aslan, although it's not. It's just the first time he realizes, right? And it's a very unusual book in the Narnia series, The Horse and His Boy.
If anything, it was bad luck to meet so many lions along the way. And Aslan's like, you met only one lion.
Only one lion,
he was swift of foot.
Yeah, it's a great line. But then he asked about his friend Aravis. Why did you clawed Aravis in the back? If you're the only lion, you injured my friend. And Aslan says, I'm not telling you her story. I'm telling you yours. I don't want to let that trivialize at any level the suffering of our brothers and sisters. And I don't want at any level to say somehow that I'm better or somehow that I'm deserving of peace and prosperity. But there is a level of the sovereign goodness of God over all of his people and the way he cares for them. And I look back at the Christians who have gone before and how they understood their own persecution to be a mark of God's goodness. I go to my friend Rod Thompson, an Australian who wrote a book years ago called Shocked by Blessing. I wish you could find it here. It needs to be published in America, but it's available down there. If you go through all the passages in the Bible where God calls people blessed, that may not be a group you want to be a part of. We're always like, God, please bless me. The first person blessed was Abel. And then it just goes downhill from there. There's just a different criteria, which is, by the way, why the health and prosperity form of the gospel is just not the gospel at all, why it's so damaging, because it just misses what is fundamentally true about the gospel.
I remember this might have been a couple of years ago, but there was somebody, a Christian singer that I love, posted a photo on Instagram, and it was a young child in Yemen when the famine was killing so many people, and I assume it still is ongoing there. But it was a child who was clearly malnourished, and it was a really difficult picture to see. And she said something like, if this is hard for you to look at, you shouldn't look away, because this, let it spur you to action and that kind of thing. And I think she was raising money for an organization that was hoping to alleviate some of that suffering, which is a good thing. But I really struggled with that because that picture was really difficult for me just personally. It was hard to look at, hard to get out of my mind afterwards, and just hard to emotionally deal with. And I think that's sort of what you're talking about, Shane, too, which is because there was nothing I could do to help this girl in that actual picture. I don't know who that girl was. And that's all I wanted to do in that moment, was to find that child and help her.
You remember the picture of the little Syrian boy who had washed up on the beach? That one hit me harder than any picture I think I've ever seen.
Right. And, we're both parents, or all three of us are parents. And it was just really, really hard. And I think one of the things that I've come away with just after that, and after, again, hearing the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Nigeria and so many other places around the world, China, is that, and I'm going to say this knowing full well that I'm not currently accomplishing this, and I don't know that I ever will be able to, But I think one of the ways we can honor what they're going through is to hold our own lives more loosely. And that includes our children, and the things that we hold most dear. Just realizing that death here is not really death, and that, God has called us to something bigger. So again, I say that as a parent, knowing that I'm not doing that, and I don't know that I'll ever be able to do that. But I do think we can honor what they're going through by not thinking of it as, because I think when we start to think of it as something like aberrant or something that wasn't supposed to happen, then not only do we dishonor the sovereignty of God and think of ourselves as somehow better, even if we wouldn't put it that way, that's sort of what we're saying, but we're also dishonoring what they're currently going through, because they believe in the same God we believe in, and they trust the same Jesus we trust in. And for some reason, right now, this is their plight, and that's no less real or more real than our own. And so I think the more loosely we can hold the things that we wish we could control, the more we can recognize them as blessings that God gives and takes away in his good pleasure. And, just trust that our future glory will be made richer because of it. I think that's the only thing we really can know.
Well, Maria, that reminds me the way you're invoking these impulses toward justice that we have. When we see suffering, we want to alleviate it. And in many ways, that is relevant as well to an issue that we're definitely going to see more of in 2021, and that is the racial justice issue here in the United States and the claims that are being made surrounding that, and how Christians deal with that sort of thing. We've talked quite a bit about that at the Colson Center. I actually had a guest on my podcast recently who talked about that, and it does warrant a lot of discussion because it's a confusing subject. On the one hand, we as Christians must be the first people to stand up against injustice wherever we see it. And yet we live in a culture where calls for justice are uniquely confusing because they're bound up with bigger worldview claims that run counter to the gospel, run counter to the Christian view of humanity. And so let's talk about that, because inevitably there are going to be incidents that rekindle this particularly hot issue that ends up resulting in protests and even spilling over into riots often, and has multiple times over the course of 2020, with no resolution in sight. How can Christians be a voice of peace, a voice of resolution, and a voice of justice without falling for some ideology?
Well, I think there's two types of issues we can expect. I mean, one is the racially charged issue, whether it's another horrific encounter between police officers and an African American victim or something like that, or it's not a victim, it's actually a perpetrator that gets out of hand and the story comes out later, but the video looks bad. We've had both of those situations, or either of those situations are realistic possibilities, and it'll be a repeat of history, and it'll uncover and it'll scratch off the scab, and the wound will be, that we have that goes way back in our history will continue. Or there'll be an incident in which there'll be a supposed injustice, like J.K. Rowling sending out a tweet, and it will be equated with that sort of injustice. And all of that will expose the problems that we have right now dealing with the God-given inherent thing about us that demands justice, which, by the way, screams an awful lot about what's true about the world, but it's built in us. But our fundamentally backwards, wrong way of trying to get there as a culture. And so either one of those things or both of those sorts of situations will happen, I think, in 2021, and it'll reveal something. It'll reveal that we are absolutely lost in an area where Christians can and should be leading. Unfortunately, when it comes to this issue, particularly of race, in our attempts to not be captivated by the wrong worldview assumptions of, for example, critical race theory or some form of cultural Marxism, that's now become a get-out-of-jail-free card. In other words, critical race theory or critiquing critical race theory is an excuse for Christians not to ever think that there's a problem with race at all. And this is underscoring kind of the tendency that Christians have to run away from the brokenness instead of running into it. Christians are always at their best. We say this all the time. Chuck Colson said it all the time, when they're running into the brokenness. And there's a lot of brokenness right now. We can acknowledge the fact that there is racial division. Some of it's structural, that is in the in our cultural experience right now, and in our cultural structures right now, without punting towards a fundamentally wrong way of seeing the human person and the human problem like critical race theory is. And I'll point people again to a video we did about, is critical race theory biblical, that's been viewed hundreds of thousands of times and shared and used at churches because it's really good and it shows the difference. I do worry right now, though, that because things have been politicized, because we have, I think, a fundamentally wrong understanding of how sin infects us. It affects us personally and then infects us structurally, that we're either tempted to use critical race theory or to use critical race theory as an excuse to never deal with the race issue at all. And neither one of those things are the way of Jesus, or are helpful. So that's going to be a challenge for 2021. And it's not just a challenge, though, and this is, I guess, the point that I was trying to make by giving the two extremes, right? There will be a racially charged incident, or there will be an incident of supposed injustice, like a J.K. Rowling tweet, that gets put into that category. And the problem will be Christians will miss an opportunity to lead, because Christians do have a fundamentally better vision of the human person, of human dignity, of human value, of the human problem, and about a way forward than any other religious worldview, and certainly any other secular worldview that's out there.
I want to add this before we hear from Maria here on this, because the interview I did with Thaddeus Williams, he's the author of Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth, 12 questions Christians should ask about social justice. And he really pushes back hard on this knee-jerk reaction that a lot of us tend to have, where as soon as we hear claims about social justice, we slam the door shut and we say, this is cultural Marxism or whatever. This is a worldview claim that's going to subsume my Christianity, and I can't buy into it. And he differentiates very clearly between something he calls social justice A and social justice B. Social justice A makes the claim that there are systemic and individual injustices perpetrated in our world, and Christians should be the first people to address them according to biblical standards of justice. Social justice B is this all-encompassing, overly simplistic system, like critical race theory, that sees everyone fundamentally as either oppressors or the oppressed, and that rubric of reality doesn't fit the real world. That's why it's a harmful ideology.
Yeah. It strikes me that there's some sort of needle that we need to thread here that is really difficult to know how to do. But on the one hand, I think of this obviously is going to be a gross oversimplification of what's going on. But, if my daughter is crying in the middle of the night because she thinks there's a bogeyman in her closet, and I come in and I disagree, and I know that there's not a bogeyman in her closet, I'm not going to refuse to comfort her because she's wrong. There's an acknowledgement that she is suffering in that moment, and she feels sad and she feels scared, and I want to deal with that. And
I think
sometimes
have Monster Spray? My parents had Monster Spray. They came in and they did Monster Spray. They would go, and they'd say, "Oh, the monsters are gone now."
Oh, that's adorable.
Yeah.
I can't believe you fell for that, Shane. I don't know. That kind of hurts your credibility.
Well, if you knew me better, you'd realize how gullible I truly am, and how easy it would be for me to fall for something like that.
That's good to know. But what I mean is, like, John, you referenced that sometimes I think in our rightly calibrated aversion to critical race theory, we use that to say that anybody who comes to me and says, our African-American brothers and sisters or people in my church or in my community, they say that they're hurt by this or that they're confused or whatever. And we might use that to brush that off and say, well, they shouldn't be, or they're wrong, or they're believing a lie or whatever. And I think one of the first things the church and Christians should do is, no matter what the reason for someone's hurt, is acknowledge that they're hurt. And try to alleviate that, be comforting to people, be kind to people when they're hurt. And then this is where I'm talking about threading the needle, because at the same time, we want to live not by lies. And if we see something that's not true, we can't pretend that it's true just because people are hurting. And it reminds me of I don't have the experience, obviously, of being a racial minority in the US, but I am female. And I've worked in one of my jobs a couple years ago in another life was I used to work in human resources. And I actually worked at human resources at a steel plant. So a steel plant. So I was probably like one of 3 women in that whole like 5,000 person organization. It was a really fun job, but also very challenging. And I remember one of my friends, I was sharing a situation that had happened at work, and a friend of mine said, "Oh, they're just really sexist against you, like they're not used to having women there." And whether or not she was right, for the rest of my time working there, I saw everything that happened to me through that lens. And I got pretty bitter and upset. And for the record, I do think that there was some nasty behavior that happened there, and there was probably some sexism there, or just inappropriateness or whatever. But it colored my view of my job there in such a way that was so detrimental to both me and the organization that there was just no good fruit that came out of that. And I think that that's, again, the needle that the church has to help thread, which is to say there are issues with policing and racial biases, and there's racial biases even in systems outside of policing. I even was in some of my reporting this year looking at disparities in maternal health, and there's some really scary disparities in maternal health, specifically for Black women. And so I think we have to look at that rightly, but at the same time, not allow people or encourage people away from seeing their entire life and existence in the United States as determined by their race, because it strikes me that that's what sort of the wokeness and the critical race theory is attempting to do, which is everything that happens to you, everything that's said to you, everything you experience is either happening because of or in spite of your race. And that's just going to make for a lot of confused, bitter, angry, hurting people. And that's not what we want.
Well, folks, thanks so much for listening. That's all the time we've got for today. But you can check out and see if our predictions are right as we move forward into the coming year. And we'll probably issue all the necessary retractions when it turns out that our predictions were completely off base. You can visit breakpoint.org, where we'll put up links for all the stories that we've mentioned today on the program, as well as a wealth of always fresh worldview resources to help you live and think like a Christian. Well, we are doing our first recommendation segment here of 2021. We've had some good recommendations last year. We had some bad recommendations as well, all from John. But we want to start. Maria and John and I want to start off the year.
Hey, just because it's too hard, Shane, don't call it bad. My recommendation: too hard. You just gotta get tougher. You just, if it's over your head, you gotta grow taller. That's how
they're just sports oriented half the time. Well, Maria's gonna come and recommend a Brothers Karamazov or some other Dostoevsky work here. So, it reminds me of that joke.
Do you know how you can know that someone is actually either
you're gonna steal my joke? Go ahead.
And CrossFit. It was my joke. If it was yours, you took it from me in the first time this came up, which is how you know someone is reading a Russian novel.
Yes.
They'll tell you. Yeah. It's the same way you know if they're in CrossFit.
Guys, I don't know if I told you this, but I read Dostoevsky last year.
You did mention it.
Yeah, we've
heard did I mention that? Oh, okay.
Once or twice.
Well, my recommendation for the beginning of the year here is going to be to give up the illusion.
Hey, I got a question before we get started. Because you always go first with your recommendations. Why do you always get to go first? Why is it always Shane's recommendation goes first?
Well, John, see, a few months ago, you asked me to start sort of hosting this thing and doing the intros and outros. And
Shane's recommendation was just about to be to think of yourself less, John.
It was. It literally was. And now you've just become the best object lesson imaginable.
You offered a beautiful illustration of that.
That was great. I think we should let Maria go first.
Go for it, Maria.
Oh, my goodness.
I'll go last. Wow. I'll go last this time. Ladies
so
first.
Humbled. Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to recommend is an album that is not new, but is new to me that I found this year in the pain of driving my kids to school in the morning and needing something to put on the radio. And so there's a Christian singer. Her name is Sarah Groves. She's sort of a singer-songwriter. And several years ago now, I think 2008, this album is from. It's called Invisible Empires. This was sort of my first full year on the team at Colson Center, but to a hammer, everything's a nail. And now everything I see is somehow related to worldview and higher philosophical things. And this album just strikes me as super philosophical, but it's also really fun and has catchy melodies. And so it's called Invisible Empires. My favorite song on it is called Scientists in Japan. And it's sort of tongue in cheek, but it's a funny song about how there's scientists in Japan that are building a robot that are going to take your job. And somebody in France is designing a heart that's going to save your mom and this kind of stuff. But the chorus is just her saying over and over again, who's going to stay and think about it? Which is sort of her saying, like, we're sure we want to do this, right? Like, we know we can, but should we do this? Which again is a very worldview-ish question, I think. And she has a lovely voice and it's catchy music. So Invisible Empires by Sarah Groves.
Very cool. Some transhumanist vibes there.
Mm-hmm.
That is worldviewish. I like that. I'll check it out. John, what about you?
Oh, you're going to go last now.
Yeah, I just said I would.
That's amazing. Okay.
It's turning over a new leaf in 2021.
That is good.
Now, so you already provided the illustration for thinking only about yourself. Now I'm providing the illustration of selflessness.
You should be proud of all that humility.
I gotta throw up.
That would be.
There's a passage. I haven't said anything about C.S. Lewis this time, so I'll just say this. There's a moment in the Screw Tape Letters that I love where he goes. He's trying to teach Wormwood how to make his patient proud. And he goes, your patient may say, oh, there's the pride welling up. I've got to squelch that. And then so he squelched it and he's humble. And then sneak into his thought the gratifying realization, by Jove, I'm being humble. And then make him proud of his attempt again and again until he says, don't do this too long because eventually you'll wake up his sense of the ridiculous, in which case he'll laugh at you and go to bed, which I just love.
Good.
My recommendation is not a Russian novel, but it is as long as a Russian novel. And actually, it is a writer that philosopher Peter Kreeft said is the new Dostoevsky. So there you go. But
I don't know about that. I don't know.
Well, it's an impressive book. I've gone through a couple of his, and it's just when you're jumping in 2021, a new year, especially for the dads out there. This was a book that I first saw recommended by Steve Garber, talking in a little part of his. He published a book in 2020 of some meditations, and one of those had to do with an observation about dads and about sons, and it really hit home. Just as I have a son, and I'm the only son of my dad, and just all of that sort of stuff. He put it all together. And it led me to read this book, and it is a massive book. I think it's 1,200 pages. It is by a writer named Michael O'Brien, and it's called A Father's Tale. And it's, in a sense, a sort of modern-day retelling of the prodigal son. Dad with two sons, but it's a journey that goes essentially around the world. It's very well written. The characters are really fascinating. Michael O'Brien, by the way, is also the author of a book called Islands of the World, which I followed up with, which was actually quite good as well and really interesting. But A Father's Tale, especially for dads that are, wanting to be intentional to jump in and think about what is communication, what's good communication between me and my kid, particularly my son. What do I need to do? What kind of person do I need to be accessible to my kids? That sort of thing. Which is a conversation that I'm consistently having with myself. And this is a fascinating recommendation because I read this actually in the early days of the pandemic. So I think I jumped into this back in March or April, and I probably read it and I don't read a lot of fiction. People would be ashamed of me. I don't read nearly enough fiction. But I probably read this in a week, and it has haunted me. It haunted me for the rest of 2020. It really did. And so many of the things that came out of that book. So, A Father's Tale, Michael O'Brien is the author, and kudos to Steve Garber for that good recommendation.
Wow, excellent. I'm going to check that one out too.
This is why Shane doesn't want to go last, because now he just can't be as good as our recommendations.
Yeah, how am I going to top any of that? Well, my recommendation is going to be much simpler and more
this is something
godly,
that you have never recommended, Shane, and I'm surprised. I need to ask you about this here as we
Sure.
enter a new year. I mean, a big part of your life is lived underwater. Like you look for stuff underwater, and you've never talked about this. You've never recommended to people. Now, obviously, it's kind of
Guys,
hopeless to
Shane
recommend.
has gills. I don't know if you are
I
I
watching
do.
this
I'm
or
actually just
listening,
like Kevin Costner. If you look behind my ears, there's gills there.
They made
It's,
a movie about him. It's weird.
They
No,
did. Well,
yeah.
I mean, I can recommend scuba diving certainly, but I'll just say my favorite thing about it is that is the thought that nobody in the history of the world until within almost my lifetime, like my lifetime and my dad's lifetime, have ever been able to do this. Humans literally couldn't go underwater, and now we can. And I live in Florida, which is one of the best places in the country, probably the best place in the country to do that, if you don't count Hawaii. So, being underwater is just an incredible opportunity to see the wonders of God's creation and things that, were heretofore unseen. It's like things for which Christ has not been sufficiently glorified yet. As a friend of mine, Justin Hester, put into a song he wrote about it called Secret Joys. So, yeah, I love scuba diving. But that wasn't what I was going to recommend this time. I'm going to recommend disabusing ourselves of the delusion and illusion, however you want to say it, that Facebook friends are real friends. I'm not saying you can't have real friends who are on Facebook. I want to say that social media has deeply distorted our view of friendship. I think we need to, in 2021, reclaim true friendship. Invest deeply in a group of friends. It'll necessarily be a small group of friends this year. And the best guide that I know for this is, and I recommended Lewis's The Four Loves before, but specifically his chapter on friend love. The Greek word is philia. And he differentiates it more beautifully from all the other forms of love than any other writer that I've ever encountered. He calls it the most spiritual of the earthly loves. It is a love that is, he called it the meeting of naked souls rather than the meeting of naked bodies, as in eros. And it's deeply neglected these days. It's a forgotten love, and it's one of which we are, I think, deeply suspicious, partially because we've distorted all the love so badly, but especially eros, where everything's become sexualized. It's gobbled up everything. And I think it's also friendship, true friendship, is something that's deeply blessed my life. I mentioned my friend Justin, and he has been instrumental, along with my friend Dale, in helping me to realize that friendship is the solution to many of the pre-existing conditions we've talked about when it comes to COVID. I'm not talking about medical conditions. I'm talking about spiritual conditions, things that resulted in just severe feelings of isolation and loneliness and the deaths of despair, people who've just given up on life. I think one of the key resources that God has given us to prevent that sort of despair is just friendship. It's just people in the trenches with you. And every time I think about this, I'm reminded of Frodo and Sam in The Lord of the Rings, where, I forget whether this line is in the book or not. It's been a while. I need to go back and read the books. But there's a line in the movies where, Sam is praising Frodo to the sky for doing what he's done, and Frodo says, someday the kids are going to want to hear the story about Samwise Gamgee the Brave. I want to hear more about him. Frodo wouldn't have gotten very far without him, would he, Daddy? And that picture of friendship there is just one of the best portrayals in literature, and it's a reminder, I think, of the centrality of this love. So invest deeply in some friends this year. Don't be overcome by the illusion that people online that are labeled friends by Mark Zuckerberg are really your friends, because that's not what the love was meant to do. It was meant to hold you up through the hard times and give you an opportunity to exult with fellow believers, most of all, in the good times. So I don't know if that's too My Little Pony to recommend the magic of friendship, but I just did, so we'll go with it.
The magic of friendship.
Yeah.
Well, you ended it well, because when you started, I was like, what's he doing? Like, I was like, instead of talking about the joys of the beauties under the sea, I'm going to burst your bubble about Facebook friends. It started out like a real negative, but you turned it, and the Four Loves is always a great way to start 2020 or 2021.
Well, good recommendations, guys. Maria, it's been great having you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And folks, that does it for today. You can visit breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories that we've mentioned on today's program, as well as a wealth of always fresh resources to help you think and live like a Christian in today's culture. For John Stonestreet and Maria Bear, I'm Shane Morris. Happy New Year. We'll see you next week.